High school can be a challenging time for anyone, from puberty, cliques, and extracurriculars to all the drama that inevitably occurs between friend groups. It's a lot. They always say to choose your friends wisely, and while Skylar Neese knew that her friends liked to participate in backstabbing, she never thought that they would take that role so literally. Skylar Annette Neese was born in February of 1996. She was described as an intelligent, compassionate, sometimes stubborn, but overall bubbly girl. When she was in second grade, she met this girl named Sheila at the community center in town. Even though they lived 20 miles away from each other, they were besties for life. Sheila's parents divorced in 2000. When her mom remarried, she moved closer to Skylar, which meant that she finally got to go to the same school as her best friend. A tween girl's dream come true. With Sheila by her side, Skylar knew that she could face anything in high school would throw her way. In 2010, Skylar and Sheila began their freshman year at University High. While the girls were surviving being fresh meat as best they could, they met this girl named Rachel, and immediately the three were joined at the hip. Rachel was this cute little redhead and was an aspiring actress and singer. She had a lot in common with Skylar and Sheila. All three girls lived for social media. Like, they were constantly scrolling on Instagram and posting to Twitter. They were also all only children of divorced parents, which they bonded over right off the bat. Ooh, yes, we love a good trauma bonding moment. Our posse of peeps also loved to get into trouble, as all high schoolers do. They did all the typical bad girl things like breaking curfew, taste testing the spirits in their parents' bar carts, and dabbling in the devil's lettuce. I definitely would not have been friends with them. I was a goody two-shoe. I was in youth group at the time. But looking back, friends and parents of Skylar and Rachel claim that Sheila was definitely the Regina George of the group. She was often the instigator of these activities, and Skylar's cousin even described Sheila as a bad seed. A lot of Skylar's other friends said they wouldn't even hang out with Skylar if Sheila was around, and they described her as mean and controlling. Shall we play a game of Let's Count the Red Flags? Rachel's friends were also very wary of Sheila. They said Rachel's personality and behavior became completely changed once Rachel started hanging out with her. But Rachel and Skylar just didn't see it. They loved Sheila and had no intention of ending their friendship with her, because every Regina George needs a Gretchen and Karen by her side. Friends say that Skylar and Sheila's friendship made more sense because Skylar looked up to her, and they'd grown up together. But they said that they didn't understand why Rachel was friends with Sheila. Rachel came from a wealthy family, which made her automatically more popular, so it wasn't a status thing. She also came from a very religious family, so maybe the friendship came about because Rachel wanted to take a walk on the wild side and participate in activities she wouldn't normally be able to do. But most people believed Rachel loved the power and intimidation factor that Sheila held over people. The girl world can be an absolute jungle, and Rachel was starting to learn that she really liked the view from the top of the food chain. So despite Sheila often being described as the root of all evil, the dynamics and the loyalties of the group actually shifted when Rachel entered the picture. One night in 2011, the Plastics were hanging out, having a sleepover, and doing the scandalous things they normally do. Skylar was put in a very uncomfortable position because apparently Sheila and Rachel got a little too turned and ended up doing some naughty things together. Skylar was super upset by this, so she got into a nasty feud with Sheila. After the catfight, things were never quite the same between Skylar and Sheila. The two started to drift apart while Sheila and Rachel began to grow closer to one another. Slowly but surely, the cracks were beginning to get bigger and bigger in the Plastics. So Sheila and Rachel would do this thing where they would plan certain days to dress alike, and they would purposely leave Skylar as the odd girl out, which as a 15-year-old girl, that's absolutely brutal. Oh, was today army pants and flip-flops day? I must have missed the memo. Did we talk about it or something? Around sophomore year, Sheila and Rachel had boyfriends and were starting to, do all the things that young high schoolers do. But Skylar wasn't as interested in boys at the time, which meant Rachel and Sheila now had another thing they got to bond over that Skylar was left out of. Skylar essentially became the immature little sister of the group to the two girls. Like, she really started to get on their nerves. You know when you're walking with two people on the sidewalk and then someone has to walk in the back because you can't all fit? That's how Skylar was feeling all the time. But the one thing that Skylar had over the girls was that she knew all the delicious secrets of the group and would even threaten to expose them if she had to. Skylar had a pretty active Twitter account, and she would sometimes hint about all the dirty deets she knew on people that she exposed to the school. It was not uncommon for Skylar and Sheila to get into some pretty epic Twitter fights. Like, things would get really ugly very quickly. Twitter. You always have the tea, and it's always piping. In 2012, a tipping point came in the friendship when Skylar and Sheila went on a week-long trip to Myrtle Beach and spent the entire time fighting. When they got home, Sheila told Rachel that Skylar had to go. That year in school, fellow students and teachers said that they often heard Sheila and Rachel discussing the best way to dispose of a body. Wait, what? You're telling me that these two 16-year-olds are like, no, chopping it up is a bit too messy. What if we bury it or dissolve it? And the teachers are like, you silly kids. Okay, but apparently there were actually two really good reasons why no one thought of this as a sketchy topic of convo. First of all, in bio class, they were focusing on a forensic science section that covered decaying bodies. So it's totally possible that they could have been talking about class that day. And an insane coincidence is that a few weeks earlier, a body had been discovered behind the school, so that was obviously a hot topic of conversation around the campus. Okay, that totally checks out, but like, what are the odds of that? Also, whose body was it? And why was it there? I have so many questions and not enough answers. On the other side of things, there were some students who said they definitely heard the two girls saying that they were trying to figure out a way to get rid of Skylar. Some kids even warned Skylar and were like, yo, have you heard what your friends are saying about you? And I guess she just shrugged it off because those two girls were always playing games. Honestly, I feel bad for Skylar at this point. Her friends are so cruel, and here she is still making up excuses for them, giving them the benefit of the doubt. Oh, honey, you deserve so much better. So Skylar confronted the girls on it, and of course, they assured her it was nothing. But that spring semester, Sheila and Rachel decided to seal the deal. Skylar had to go. Despite all the dysfunction in the trio, the group of the girls continued to hang out together, and while Skylar was painfully aware that her friendship with Sheila was strained, she had no idea what would come next. So in July of 2012, Rachel was supposed to go to this Catholic church camp for 2 weeks. She told Sheila that they would have had to go ahead with the plan before she left for camp. I guess she thought if you slash your best friend one night and then go to church camp the next week, kind of cancels out. So like if I eat this coffee cake and then bag of spinach, then it cancels out, right? On Thursday, July 5th at around 10 p.m., Skylar got home from her shift at Wendy's, kissed her parents goodnight, and went to her room. Around midnight, Sheila and Rachel texted her and asked if she wants to come along for a joyride. And Skylar, happy to be invited out by the girls who Wisconsin excluded her, was like, I'm in. Sheila's pulled up to the Neese's apartment complex a little after that, and Skylar climbed out of her bedroom window. And now, Skylar's a seasoned pro at this sort of thing. Her method of escape was to put a small bench right underneath her bedroom window so she could get back in when she got home. I mean, I snuck out of the house, but I never snuck out of my window. I snuck out of my front door. I just had to be quiet about it. The three musketeers drove away, but Skylar had no idea that the thing clanking around the trunk was a shovel. And next to the shovel was some fresh clothes, towels, and a bottle of bleach. The girls drove around for a bit along the route that Sheila and Rachel had planned to take. But they saw a cop car parked at an intersection and got scared, so they made a last-minute decision to take a different route. They pulled into this one-lane back road 21 miles from Skylar's home and turned off the car. The girls had been to this spot a few times in the past when they were doing their mischievous activities, so Skylar wasn't thinking much of it. The girls all got out and kind of just walked around chatting for a while. At some point, the group decided to partake in a little Mary Jane moment, so Rachel and Sheila told Skylar to go get a lighter from the car. Skylar walked to the car, and the two girls on the count of three pulled out these large blades that they had been hiding in their hoodies and started slashing Skylar as hard as they could. Skylar tried to run, but she wasn't a match for 5'8" Rachel, who tackled her to the ground. Skylar put up a hell of a fight and was even able to get Rachel's blade at one point, but the two girls overpowered her, and within a matter of minutes, Skylar was gone. Sheila and Rachel had planned to bury Skylar, but the ground was a bit too rocky for their shovels. They moved her next to a big tree and covered her with a bunch of brush, leaves, and branches. Then they washed themselves off in a creek and tossed out their dirty clothes and weapons. After that, they turned off Skylar's phone, left it next to her body, and fled the scene. Before the sun had even come up, the girls were snuggled back in bed. So around 9 a.m. that morning, Sheila tweeted, "Always keep your cool." And I thought the girls at my high school were bad. The next day, Skylar's parents left super early for work, so they just assumed that Skylar was still in bed. That afternoon, Skylar's dad came home because she was supposed to borrow his car to drive to her shift at Wendy's. But when he got there, Skylar wasn't home, and her bedroom door was locked from the inside. Then Skylar's dad saw the bench outside under her open window, so he called up Sheila and asked if she went out the previous night. Sheila said she talked to Skylar on the phone around midnight, but other than that, she hadn't heard from her or seen her. So now, of course, Dad is trying not to panic, and he's thinking, maybe she went out last night and got a ride to her shift. Or maybe she snuck out to see a friend and then lost track of time. But when Skylar's manager at Wendy's called asking where she was, her dad realized that he should panic and call the police. Right after he did, he got another call from Sheila, who was like, okay, I didn't tell you the whole truth. Sheila then went on to tell Skylar's dad that she and Rachel were out and his daughter that night joyriding in Morgantown. She claimed they picked up Skylar at 11 p.m. but had her home by midnight. But they didn't drop Skylar off at home. They apparently dropped her off on the street corner so she could sneak inside without having her parents waking up. A while after Sheila's phone call, her and her mom went over to Neese's apartment to help look for Skylar. Like, they legit went to door with police asking if anyone has seen or heard from the teen. But at this point, the police were desperate because they realized Skylar had been missing a lot longer than they had previously thought. Skylar's parents then remembered that their apartment complex had security cameras, so they contacted their landlord and secured the footage. Since the investigators had every reason to believe Sheila was telling the truth, they played the tapes right around midnight when Skylar was supposed to have already been home. But at 12:31 a.m., they spotted Skylar climbing out of her window and getting into a car that was parked outside the complex. And remember, this is Sheila's car that Skylar was getting into, and Sheila's standing there looking at the footage like, oh. But before she could explain herself, the landlord mentioned that the car looked like an SUV. Yeah, the footage was legit so bad and grainy that no one even realized that the car in the video was Sheila's. The whole group just assumed the landlord was right and concluded the car was a random SUV. Oh, I wonder if the landlord was in on it too. They definitely could have been trying to cover up for Sheila, maybe in exchange for some good green. Well, the whole search group was so set on this mysterious person and car that they didn't even bother to rewind the footage back to 11 p.m. when Sheila claimed she picked Skylar up. Because why would they have any reason to suspect Sheila of lying? So then the officers did the classic thing where they see a girl voluntarily leaving with someone and assume that they're a runaway. The officers told the family to wait a few days because they believed Skylar had escaped but would eventually come back. But the Neeses were like, hell no, that's not Sky. She would never do that. So the police assigned an officer to the case. The FBI also got involved because they thought Skylar's case could be linked to another missing persons case. When officials questioned Sheila, she repeated the same story she told the Neeses. The FBI agent immediately noted that Sheila was acting really weird throughout her interview. He even described her behavior as narcissistic and wrong. Which, like, damn, get her, FBI agent. He also said she seemed more curious about the investigation than she was worried about her missing best friend. Interesting. The sleuthy FBI agent then took note of Sheila's car and considered the possibility that it could have been the same one from the surveillance tapes. The next day, the officer called up Rachel, who's, being a good little Catholic girl at church camp and praising it up, and she pretended like this was the first time she heard about her friend's disappearance. Isn't lying a sin? But then again, it seems like Rachel was no stranger to sin. Okay, so Rachel agreed to do an interview once she got back from camp, but she never actually showed up, which is super sus. Finally, investigators cornered Rachel and were able to get an interview out of her. In her interview, Rachel told officials that the exact same story as Sheila, that they picked her up at 11 for a joyride and returned her before midnight. And now the detectives were getting more suspicious of the girls because their stories were almost the same, word for word, as if they were rehearsed. After all, Rachel was an inspiring actress, so that was her time to shine. As the cops started to piece things together, they realized it looked like Skylar was planning to return home that night. But things were still a bit blurry about the whole case. A month passed and school started for what should have been Skylar's junior year. On September 3rd, officials obtained warrants to seize the girls' laptops and phones. They also reviewed the surveillance tapes again. This time, the cops watched from 11 p.m. on and finally saw that Skylar only left the house once that night, which meant Sheila and Rachel lied about their timeline, and a bunch of other things. From the beginning, Sheila had tried to insert herself into the investigation and manipulate others. A few days after the slashing, Sheila literally threw herself onto Skylar's bed, sobbing, acting like she was heartbroken over her friend's disappearance. Sheila's meddling got so bad that the police told the Neeses to stop talking to her. But that didn't stop the determined teen. Instead, she just got other people to spy on Neeses for her. I guess you can do that when you're the queen bee. Speaking of queen bees and cliques, the students at the university high all started speculating what had happened. Maybe Skylar OD'd and the girls panicked and ran. Or maybe they really did have it out for her all along. The students also mentioned that Sheila and Rachel didn't act too concerned about their BFF's disappearance. It also seemed like the two girls were closer than ever. Of course, the girls began getting harassed by their classmates. Anonymous social media accounts started popping up, trying to get either of the girls to spill the tea. And while Sheila seemed to love the attention and even called the FBI her buds, Rachel was starting to crack. After looking through the girls' cell phone records, the detectives asked them why they were in the woods that night. Rachel ended up changing her story and claimed that Skylar ran off, so Sheila panicked and switched her response last minute to match Rachel's. Whew! That was a close one. Crisis averted, ladies. So at this point, the detectives were really starting to zero in on Rachel and Sheila. They had Sheila take a polygraph test, which she failed, And then they called Rachel in to do one. But Rachel didn't even make it to hers because she literally jumped out of the car on the way there and sprinted to Sheila's mom's work that was nearby to hide. Skylar's mom had just kind of had it at this point, so she made a very long Facebook post, as you do when you're mad. In the post, she wrote details about the investigation and claimed Rachel and Sheila knew more than they were letting on, and called out the fact that they wouldn't tell the truth, even after being offered immunity. Which, like, yes, go off, sis. At least someone is saying what everyone is thinking. Rachel, who was on the verge of breaking, had this big fight with her mom where she barricaded herself in her room and threatened self-harm. She then got sent to a psychiatric hospital, which Sheila started to get a little nervous about. Rachel got out 5 days later, and the cops were like, drive her to us right now for a polygraph before Sheila can get to her. Within the first few questions, Rachel broke. She confessed and told them everything, from tackling and slashing Skylar to hiding her body. Detectives were absolutely shook when they heard Rachel's confession. At that point, they were thinking like the student body and assumed Skylar had OD'd, causing the two other girls to panic. But they didn't know Skylar's slaying was this whole thought out thing. When investigators asked Rachel why she and Sheila whacked Skylar, she couldn't come up with an answer besides, we just didn't like her anymore. Rachel agreed to take them to the body, but it was super snowy and she couldn't remember exactly where they were. Well, isn't that just great? 2 weeks later, after the snow had melted a bit, canine units found skeletal remains in the woods that were later identified as Skylar's. This was 6 months after her initial disappearance. So what do Rachel and Sheila do when they hear about this? They go and post these long rest in peace photos with Skylar on their social media. I'll take a worst thing you could possibly do as a guilty suspect for $500, Alex. Rachel surrendered herself to the authorities and pleaded guilty to the manslaughter of Skylar Neese, agreeing to testify against Sheila in court. Rachel was then arrested and taken to a juvenile detention center. State troopers went to Sheila's house to arrest the partner in crime, but when they got there, no one was home. They called Sheila's mom and were like, hey, just so you know, we're trying to arrest your daughter. And she was like, we're at Cracker Barrel, can it wait? So the squad rolled up and arrested Sheila in the parking lot of the Cracker Barrel. Cracker Barrel, when you're here, you're a convict. When the news broke that Rachel and an unknown juvenile had been arrested for the slaying of Skylar Neese, University High went nuts. The girls who once defended Rachel were shocked to see her signature on the guilty plea, and I'm guessing that they went through a midlife crisis at the age of 16. I can't even imagine how I'd react if I saw something like that. Even though the police didn't name Sheila as the other suspect, everyone put 2 and 2 together. When Sheila went to trial, she pleaded not guilty to all her charges. Her behavior in that first courtroom attracted a lot of attention. She was seen smiling, and some people even thought it looked like she was even mocking them or trying to signal that everything was Gucci on her end. But a month later, when Sheila reappeared in court, it seemed like she knew that her jig was up. She started sobbing as soon as she sat down and often clung onto her attorney for support. Her attorney said that he couldn't come up with a reasonable defense to challenge Rachel's testimony, and Sheila never once apologized to the Neese family. All she did do was have her lawyer say that her family recognized Denise's sorrow. Sheila, despite showing sorrow for herself, never showed remorse when answering questions about the gruesome details. She was found guilty and sentenced to a life in prison with the possibility of parole in 15 years. Rachel, on the other hand, personally apologized to the Neese family and cried when Skylar's final moments were described in court. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Phew! And I thought that the girls at my high school were bad. I remember when having friend problems in hei school felt like the end of the world. And now, I can't even remember the dumb stuff that we used to even argue about. Well, if there's one thing that any high schooler can take from this story, it's that there's more to life than high school. And quit spilling your tea. You could get your coffee cake soggy.